Recovery is a topic that a lot of people talk about, but there's a lot of controversial opinions and hot takes and whatnot. Luckily, I've looked into the research and the science behind it a little bit, so hopefully this will be one of the more accurate places where you can get information. As usual, I'm not going to be super duper specific. It does depend on a lot of factors, so take everything I say in this video with a grain of salt. But at least I've spent the entire morning, and we're talking like a good 4 or 5 hours behind the computer reading the studies to see how I can best present the information that will be helpful for the runner. Wait, but hold on a second. 69% of you are not subscribed, and this is your chance to be in the before 10k subscribers club, so make sure you don't miss out, and let's get on with the video. Hugo's eating before run points. I have told him well. We're about to start the run in 2 minutes. I'm just gonna quickly eat a chicken and an onigiri. Current time is 1:53. We'll definitely try and start by 1:56 later, so yeah, 3 minutes max. But let's quickly eat all this and get going with the run.
Good fuck, this is so good.
It's 1:55. I wasn't kidding. Alrighty, it's 1:56, as you can see right here, and we are gonna head. You ready?
Yep.
Alright. Okay, so the first thing that we need to address, why do we need to recover? In order to answer this, I have 3 points I want to make. So as you might be able to tell from the video, I love eating, but I'll talk more about the importance of nutrition later on in the video, so make sure you watch till the end. Firstly, we need to understand what training stimulus and training effect is. Training stimulus is any run, even a run like this, also interval training. Whatever you're doing is a training stimulus. You're putting your body through the motions of a run. The training effect happens afterwards when you're recovering from it or when you have fully recovered. That's the training effect that you get from the stimulus. So every time you run, technically you do lose a bit of fitness. You're stressing the body. You are going to have like a bit of muscle damage, but it's that recovery process that super compensates. So you damage your body, but you super compensate and you actually get fitter than you were before. Your baseline becomes a bit higher after each training stimulus. Basically, you have to recover from the training before you continue the training, and that leads me to my second point, where you can avoid injuries by recovering properly. If you obviously start training before you fully recovered, you're at a slightly higher risk of getting injured, which is why I really prioritize that recovery aspect. And I feel like the elite runners are really good at riding that fine line between doing a bit too much and also recovering just in time. And this is my third point, but that's why you have to recover better to be able to train more and therefore race better. At the end of the day, you are going to race better if you have a lot of training under your belt, but you can't train a lot if you're not recovering enough. It kind of does stem back to recovery, and that's why it's such an important factor, and I'm making a full video about it today. It's also important to know that from an injury prevention standpoint, focus on the strength side of things, because obviously most injuries come from weakness, and if you can't handle that load, that running load, you're probably going to get injured. Even if you recover from an injury, if you haven't strengthened that specific thing, you're probably going to get the exact same injury again. In terms of compensatory issues, if you get injured in one side of the leg, and you obviously put more force on the other leg due to compensatory load, you probably will injure that other leg afterwards, which is exactly what happened to me recently when I did my ultramarathon training. I had to ride that fine line between doing just about enough, maybe even risking a little bit of injury, and obviously I did that tiny bit too much where I got a niggle on race week, and then I ran with an injury from one night in Manly. With every injury, you kind of learn a little bit, but the other thing that does lead to injury is using the same shoe all the time. So if you don't have a shoe rotation, you are more likely to stress and overload one part of the leg. When I talk to physios and podiatrists, a lot of them tell me the two major factors that normally contribute to injury the most is lack of strength training and lack of shoe rotation. I obviously acknowledge that there's so many other factors which we're going to talk about in this video, such as sleep and even external stress, which is obviously outside of our control a lot of times, but shoe rotation and strength are just as important for injury prevention, and I thought we'd touch on that before we move into the video. So the first element we're going to talk about regarding recovery is foam rolling. The benefits of foam rolling are quite inconclusive, and therefore you should take that into account before implementing it in your training, or if you're a coach, take it into account before you recommend it to other people. There's a little bit of evidence to show that pre-rolling, meaning doing foam rolling before the run, can increase flexibility a little bit, but you're not going to get any enhanced performance from the foam rolling beforehand. The reason why foam rolling is a little bit hard to talk about and also research is because of the fact that a lot of people foam roll with different intensities, as in the amount of pressure they put on their muscles. On top of that, there's different varying levels of fatigue-inducing activities that are tested within foam rolling. So even if you get like a systematic review or a meta-analysis that looks at multiple studies, you still don't know how hard they were foam rolling in the study and also what exercise they were doing beforehand to get to that fatigue state. And all the sample sizes seem to be pretty small in these studies. But one thing we know for sure is that everyone involved in foam rolling studies are being taught how to foam roll properly to an extent, even if it may be different pressures. But they're not being told to foam roll their tendons, they're not being told to foam roll their bones. So that's one thing to obviously keep in mind. You shouldn't be foam rolling any tendons or bones or joints, and you should predominantly be focusing on foam rolling your muscle belly. All the tendons do is attach the muscle to the bone. You don't really want to be foam rolling that because near the tendons you're going to have a lot of bone as well, and you don't want to be foam rolling the tendon into the bone. Like, that's definitely not good for you. Only foam roll your muscle belly. And aside from that, the placebo effect is pretty huge, so if you think it is beneficial, I'm sure all of you have heard about how strong placebo effect is. If you truly believe that it will do good for you, then I think foam rolling will do good for you. I have friends that are elite who do foam rolling every single day. Jake Barclough, who runs like 280k a week. Obviously, he's probably getting a fair amount of soft tissue release and also blood flow to the area from foam rolling, so I can see why it might help him, but I don't think it's a necessity, and if you don't truly believe in it, then I think you can get away without foam rolling as well. Funnily enough, I actually did an Instagram poll on my story, and a lot of people replied. I think we got like hundreds of responses or votes, and yeah, it looks like majority of the people don't foam roll that much. Less than once a week, so we're talking like once a month or maybe even never. And only a few people do foam rolling every single day. So in regards to sleep, there's a lot of studies that look into this sort of stuff, but there's very little that look into the effect of sleep on running specifically. So there's not much actual evidence to show that there's an endurance performance benefit to it, but I guess this video is about recovery, so we'll talk about what I know about sleep so far. Sleep is heavily studied in like different sports, and to be fair, a lot of the desired outcomes for recovery from other sports will translate to running as well anyway, and also even other physiological adaptations that are beneficial for different sports will be helpful as well. We're talking about reaction time, mental focus, muscle recovery. Yeah, in general, I feel like it's pretty hard to argue that sleep is bad for you. I think it's universally accepted with the science that it is beneficial. It's just we don't know to what extent it helps with running performing specifically, but we still know that for recovery, it is definitely a huge factor. So I think there's 3 different reasons why there's very little research for sleep on recovery and performance for running specifically. I think the first reason is that running has such a big age range. So you see, 9-year-olds completing a marathon, but we also see these super young runners running a fast 5k or a 10k. And obviously we have everything in between both genders. It's just such a diverse sport compared to other sports like maybe soccer or football or whatever you want to call it. So this actually means that, in order for all these studies to be a bit more credible, they kind of need to have a diverse group and maybe like a bigger participant pool. And it's hard to organize studies like that with such a huge age range. But secondly, I think this is more of the case, but the running boom is super recent, COVID all the way up to now. And I think with scientific studies, there's always a bit of a lag between when something has boomed and also the studies that come with it. So I think the next decade will be super interesting in terms of the studies that come out regarding running. I think science in running is going to become huge. But thirdly, like I said earlier, there's a lot of studies that have been done on athletes that do other sports, and the desirable physiological kind of traits and benefits that they're testing on are applicable to running as well. So that's why there's not much of a need, I guess, to do running specific research, but I think there will be as we go forward, because as time passes by, there'll be more studies done anyway. So hydration is also very inconclusive in terms of the science. I think whoever made the rule where you have to drink like a certain amount of liters per day, I don't even know what that number is. It was kind of made up randomly. Same with the 10,000 steps a day and all that. So I think it's pretty important to realize that your body's really smart in the sense that it will tell you when it's thirsty. So you should always hydrate to thirst. So when you're thirsty, hydrate a bit more, and if you're not, you don't have to drink that much. The other good indicator is to look at your pee. So obviously if it's too yellow, then you might need to hydrate a little bit more, but if your pee is pretty clear, you probably don't need to be hydrating any more than you already are. And also if you're peeing a lot, that is an indicator that you might be overhydrating, so you don't have to be peeing like 8 times a day. That's what I heard recently. I thought it was healthy to do that, but yeah, you don't need to be drinking that much. When you do sweat out liquids, then you do have to hydrate. So for the most part, I think for me at least, I have been fine with just hydrating to thirst, and yeah, I highly recommend everyone else does that as well. Speaking of hydration though, I'm actually super thirsty, so we're gonna go get a drink now. Are you thirsty as well?
Yeah, my mouth is so dry.
That's a pretty good indicator we need to be drinking. Let's go. A good topic to move on to now is nutrition. One of the studies I'm about to reference is something that Gabby Villa, she's super experienced, works with some of the best athletes in the entire country of Australia. I'm subscribed to a newsletter which, has a lot of good information in it. And I recently read one of the email newsletters that she sent, which had a study that was conducted pretty recently in September 2024. And it showed a group of 10 cyclists that underwent 2 different scenarios. So the same 10 cyclists did 2 separate experiments at 2 different times. So one of them was where they did like a high intensity interval training on the bike, obviously, where they had carb ingestion right after, meaning they refueled with carbohydrates right after the session. The other time that they did it, they had a 3-hour delay after the exercise and when they took the carbohydrates. This type of study is called a randomized crossover trial because all participants do 2 types of scenarios, whereas other studies do one group does this, the other group does that. It's harder to compare the two because there's a bit of like bias involved. Randomized crossover trials are basically the highest level of credibility before you move on to stuff like systematic reviews and also meta-analysis. Long story short, this is a fairly credible study and fairly recent where they worked out that ingesting carbs or refueling with carbohydrates immediately after a hard intensity session where they deplete your glycogen storage, they found out that you recover perform better the next day if you do take in carbs immediately after. So you hear about all these pros taking in carbs during their training as well. Within like an interval session, they're drinking drink mixes and taking gels and stuff like that.
This brings me on really nicely to point number 2, but this is looking specifically at fueling in the session. I am talking mostly about gels and drink mixes. I'm not a scientist or a nutritionist, but I'm pretty sure that you could be eating candy and it would be better than eating nothing.
All of this actually speeds up the process of recovery for the next day. But one thing to know is that in terms of like long term or medium term, the ability for your body to fill up its glycogen storage again isn't compromised at all. So we're just talking about people that train frequently. Like if you train at night and then you're training the next morning, it probably is beneficial to have carbs immediately after the run if you want to feel better for the next day. So the way they tested this was they took muscle biopsies and also blood samples, and also they did a time trial the next day after the high intensity interval training. And the final thing that they did was they got their rate of perceived exertion, which is like a scale of 1 to 10 how hard it felt. So what they worked out was that in terms of muscle glycogen and also molecular responses, there wasn't much of a difference between the 2 types of experiments that they did with the same people. The main thing that they realized was that their time trial performance was compromised and also their rating of perceived exertion was a bit higher. They performed worse in a time trial, but it felt harder than, when they ingested carbs right after their hard session the day before. So that was a bit of a mouthful, but the take-home message is that it's important to refuel with carbs immediately after. Some people go like low carb but high protein bars and stuff like that after a session. But what I want you guys to remember is that it's important to take in carbs and protein right after. Putting this study aside, from what I understand, I think it's super important to not undereat because obviously when you're doing a lot of exercise, it's pretty hard to overeat anyway. So you might as well have a bias towards eating more than less. I have seen glimpses of studies here and there and other people that I trust on the internet that have shown that not ingesting enough carbs can lead to a lot of different stuff like less bone density and therefore a higher risk of stress fractures and that sort of stuff. And one thing I do know for sure is that sleeping will, go through your glycogen stores a little bit. And we talked about that on the podcast with Gabby Villa, so I know that for a fact. And that actually means your sleep quality will be compromised if you're not eating enough as well. So having a lot of carbohydrates in your diet as a runner is super important, not just to fuel your runs but also to sleep better as well. I think there's very little indication as to carbohydrates being bad for performance, so you might as well just eat as many carbs as you possibly can, but make sure you do have a balanced diet and get your proper high quality carbohydrates in. So moving on to stretching, it's also very inconclusive, so there's no point doing a ton of stretching if you don't believe in it, and that's why I barely ever stretch. To be honest with you, I don't think I remember stretching at all in the past few years. So I've read a ton of research all the way up to about 2021. Honestly, the data is so contradicting and there's just no kind of definitive way to say whether static stretching is good for you or not. Dynamic stretching, there's probably more of an application, and I won't talk about that too much because not many people do dynamic stretches for recovery. But what I've definitely found out is that doing 60 seconds of a stretch and just holding it can actually have detrimental effects on muscle performance. We're talking about maximum voluntary contraction, so again, I don't know how applicable that is to distance running, but all I know is my intuitive feeling is that I don't think it's good to stretch for that long. That being said, I think there is one benefit to stretching, which again, if you believe in it, it's a good placebo and you should carry on. I can see how stretching does increase blood flow to the area, and therefore you will speed up the recovery process a bit better because of that. But again, there's no research to prove that, but it makes sense in my head. But like I said earlier, I did a poll where I asked everyone, you know, how often do you foam roll and also how often do you stretch? 2 separate polls, and with both of them, most people said they barely ever stretch, as in less than 1 time a week. So we're talking about, some people replied and they're like, you need to make an option for never. And I will say, a lot of elite athletes that follow me, 90% of them or more, said that they don't foam roll at all and they don't stretch, or they do it like once a month kind of thing, but nothing significant. There were definitely a couple exceptions. There were like 2 or 3 runners that do it religiously every day, but there were way more elite runners that don't. And if we're talking about the general mass population, it was kind of a similar trend. I'd say most people don't do it on a frequent basis, and they do it like once every month or just less than once a week kind of thing, so not often. Here's a quick bonus tip. One of the most important things an athlete needs to know when training is that every single week of training, you need to feel like you can replicate the exact same thing the next week. If you can't, you're probably overtraining a little bit, because if you think about longevity, we know that we improve a lot from being consistent over a long period of time. So if you can't even replicate one training week the next week, that's definitely overtraining. We want to finish a week of training and feel like we can do that multiple weeks in a row. I get that there's a bit of nuance to it, because there are times where you want to ramp up the training and really get in a high volume week before you get into like the peaking phase, and I get that, but for the most part, you want your training to be very sustainable. Another thing I want you to remember is that the training stimulus and training effect concept is super important. Make sure you feel not fully recovered, but almost recovered before you start your next training session. Otherwise, you are constantly regressing if you're not recovering before you start your next session. So when you look at the linear trend, you could actually be constantly messing up if you're doing every single run before you've like recovered an adequate amount. So recovery is super important. When people say recovery is half of training, they actually are serious, and it's super duper important. Alrighty, I'm gonna end the video here, and I hope you can take something away from it. Stretching and foam rolling is stuff that I don't do often. I do a little bit of foam rolling, but I never static stretch. I think sleep is more important, so if you want to take one thing away from this video, I think it's the sleeping, it's the nutrition, just eating enough to make sure that you're replenishing all the fueling that you're using when you're running, and more, because sleep will use up your glycogen storage as well a little bit. I think hydration is also fairly important, and the stuff I touched on earlier about shear rotation and strength training, that will keep you injury free as well. So most of the time, taking a bit of a rest, as in taking an extra day of rest if you don't feel good, will help with super compensation, and you'll come back better for it. If you've had a good training stimulus, there's nothing wrong with taking a bit more time off to get the training effect. Again, stimulus and effect are different. There's a bit of a delay between the stimulus and the effect. You're not going to get fit immediately after an interval training session, but you will if you recover from that. That's the key take-home message. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.